This short lecture will go over religion and reform in antebellum America. It is not comprehensive, but it'll give you a brief overview of these topics. So it's important to remember that while the Constitution, and specifically the First Amendment to the Constitution, provided for religious freedom and prohibited a established church in the United States, but the process of separating church and state really took place on the ground. It occurred at different speeds in different places, and not all states provided for full religious liberty, and state established churches remained in effect, especially in places like Connecticut, where all the way until 1818 there was a linkage between church and state, and then even later in Massachusetts, which would persist until the 1830s. Coming out of the Revolution, many Americans, preachers, especially ministers, feared that the United States had become a nation of atheists, of the faithless, of deists, and that true Christian religion was falling by the wayside. Around the turn of the 19th century, you see the beginnings of the Second Great Awakening out on the Western frontier. And in particular, in Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801, you have tent meeting revivals taking place, which saw upwards of 20,000 people gathering together in open fields and in the woods and hearing preachers, Baptists and Methodist preachers that are speaking the word. And this is going to lead to a drastic increase in church membership along the frontier. Tent meeting revivals are going to spread through the Appalachian Mountains in places like Kentucky and Tennessee and elsewhere. Now, in New England, you're going to see a more less emotional awakening, and it's going to come a little bit later and less emotional than the frontier. And this is aimed at a more liberal theology. There had been a pessimism that is surrounding long-held Calvinist notions of predestination, the idea that individuals their fates are predetermined by God. You're either saved or you're damned. And that strict Calvinism had really waned by 1800 or so. And you have a generation of preachers in the early 19th century, like the Reverend Timothy Dwight or Charles Finney, as we'll see here next, that or Lyman Beecher, that are preaching a softer Calvinism, giving the individual a little bit more agency, a little bit more free will in determining their fate. Now, Charles Finney is perhaps the most well-known preacher in the nation by the 1820s, 1830s, and he comes to symbolize the Second Great Awakening in many respects. In upstate New York, where he begins preaching, you have what's known as the burn over district, burned over with zealous, with religious fervor, because of these conversions that Finney and his cohorts are producing in these churches, which is leading very successful conversions, leading to drastic increase in the number of Americans in churches. Now, this was a highly emotional sense of preaching, and it was very controversial to the standing religious authorities, who still clung to older notions of Calvinism, of the role of the minister and the role of the church attendee. Now, out of this Second Great Awakening, which is really rooted in the middle class, and this burgeoning middle class, which is just developing in the 1820s and 30s, comes what's known as the Benevolent Empire. And this was the Benevolent Empire, which was made up of various religious institutions, from churches to religious tract societies, to missionary societies, to Bible publishing houses, to reform associations. And their goal was this idea of perfectionism, that through self-discipline, individuals could perfect their own selves. And then you turn outward and you perfect the society around you. And with that, you will usher in Christ's return and the end times ultimately. But there's also, as this new middle class is forming, you have the slight beginnings of industrialization. You have an increase in wealth and leisure time among some groups within American society. There is this need to rectify material wealth with religious beliefs. If Christ is preaching, blessed are the poor, or blessed are the weak, for one day they will inherit, the kingdom of earth, then how do you rectify the fact that I am acquiring more and more wealth while other people are not? And the Second Great Awakening and Christians at this time were able to do that, as they have been able to really since. Now, part of this quest for perfectionism is going to lead to various reform efforts, whether it is stamping out the breaking of the Sabbath, working on a Sunday, whether it is eliminating prostitution or going after gambling. There's a variety of ways: prison reform, education reform, temperance, that is the prohibition of alcohol, is probably the most well-known, and that crusade will find some success in the early to mid 19th century and really find its fruition with the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1920. Now, alcohol was seen as a threat to the family, and the family was the foundation for civil society. So if the family's under threat, therefore the society must be as well. Now, whiskey was extremely popular amongst Americans. In some communities, it was probably safer to drink than water. Many people used it, made it themselves, and used it as a form of barter, a currency almost. There was a growing general fear of disorder, and this is also within the context of increased migration from places like Ireland. The temperance movement was aimed at neglectful husbands and the poorer classes in general. Again, a sense that these immigrants that are coming in can't perhaps take care of their family, and these different tropes and stereotypes about the drunken Irishman that were thrown about. You have the formation in 1826 of the American Temperance Society. So this is a perfect example of one of these institutions that made up the benevolent empire. It's this quest for perfectionism within society. And what becomes popular is this abstinence pledge that I will abstain from alcohol. Now, again, the temperance movement will find some success in places like Maine in the 1850s. There actually is a prohibition against alcohol, but at a national level, it's not going to, again, come to fruition until the 1920s. Now, sort of an outgrowth of the Second Great Awakening was the abolition movement. The push to end slavery in the United States, which went back, all the way until the Revolutionary years. As northern states began to move away from slavery, you had the beginnings of some different abolition societies in New England and whatnot. In 1817, prominent Americans, white Americans, formed what's known as the American Colonization Society. And this was exactly how it sounds, that many of these members of the society were slaveholders themselves, who believed in a gradual end to slavery and then sending the formerly enslaved back to Africa. There was some actual success with this as far as returning African Americans to Africa. They founded the Liberia colony with its capital of Monrovia, named after James Monroe, who was the president at the time. And this was focused at, again, free Blacks in American society. But many African Americans were saying, why would I want to go back to Africa? I was born here in the United States. My family has been enslaved here or has been here for generations. I don't have any interest in going to Africa. This is my home. And the colonization society, again, was controversial among some, and it will kind of linger through the antebellum period and even sort of have a resurgence in the 1860s, but it does not provide for this wide-scale end of slavery. And by 1830s, you have a more radical abolition movement, which is really symbolized by William Lloyd Garrison, who in 1831 published his Liberator anti-slavery newspaper. And in the first issue of the Liberator in 1831, he very succinctly and clearly states his goal. He says, I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I am earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. What Lloyd Garrison is demanding here is an immediate end to slavery. Whereas for decades, slave owners and even non-slaveholding abolitionists were pushing for a gradual end to slavery, that states should institute laws which, and this happened in the North, where states would pass an abolition law which would say that all enslaved people are enslaved for life, but their children will be free at the age of, say 20 or 21. So gradually over a course of decades, slavery would be abolished. And with William Lloyd Garrison and his followers, you have this transition to an immediate and full end to slavery, which will cause a lot of tension, as you can imagine, with the slaveholding South. Now, as I said, this movement for abolition was rooted in the Second Great Awakening and ideas about perfecting society. William Lloyd Garrison and the Tappan brothers, Arthur and Lewis Tappan, are going to establish the Anti-Slavery Society in 1833, a national organization aimed at ending slavery. Of course, I say national, but it is really based in the North, and they were not welcome in the slaveholding South. Very successful in small town North, larger cities where you had more rampant racism and a fear of African Americans being freed from slavery, being released from slavery, and migrating to northern cities and competing for jobs. And this was rooted in racist ideas, without a doubt. And it's important to remember that, Garrison aside, not all abolitionists were or believed in equal rights or believed in racial equality. They may have just simply not liked the institution of slavery, did not feel that it fit with the ideals of the United States, but they didn't necessarily believe that once freed that African Americans should or could exercise the same rights as white Americans. Now, Garrison is an exception to that, as we'll talk about here in a moment. Now, again, as this was dangerous in many places within the border states, states that bound up to slaveholding states like in Illinois, you have Elijah Lovejoy, who was an abolitionist editor, was killed by a mob in 1837 because of his newspaper publications denouncing slavery. So this was a very real danger for people like William Lloyd Garrison, for Elijah Lovejoy, to put those ideas out there. William Lloyd Garrison at one point is chased by a mob in Boston and nearly hung. So this was not, you did not become an abolitionist, or especially not a well-known abolitionist, on a lark. You had to really have firm convictions and courage to do so. Now, there was also Black abolitionists and free African Americans have been pushing for the end of slavery for decades as well. The most prominent that we still discuss quite a bit today is Frederick Douglass, who in 1838 escaped from slavery, moved north, and became the most famous abolitionist speaker in the country over the course of the 1840s and 1850s. And by the end of the century, many historians claim that he was the most photographed person of the 19th century. There was also the Negro Convention movement, which began in 1831 and lasted about 33 years up through the course of the Civil War, which was made up of free Black Americans pursuing abolition of slavery and the freedom of people in the South. There's several Black newspapers which pushed for abolition. Of course, Freedom's Journal in 1827, which began publication, and then Frederick Douglass's own North Star, which began publication in 1847. In 1829, David Walker, a free Black living in Boston, published an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, which really shook things up in the South, and it was banned to be sent through the mails to the South because it was a call to arms in some sense, encouraging Black Americans to defend themselves when necessary. And this Walker would die shortly after under sort of mysterious circumstances. But these ideas are filtering into the South, and they're filtering into the slave quarters on the plantations, whether or not the masters want that information to get to those places or not. In the late 1830s, again, over the course of the 1830s, as the abolition movement became more radical, the tensions between North and South are escalating. There's going to, Southerners will introduce what's known as the gag rule, which forbade the discussion of any anti-slavery petitions on the floor of Congress. They saw the abolitionists themselves, so they had many external threats, being the Southern slaveholders themselves, Northerners who were against their cause and would use violence or intimidation to try to stop abolitionists. But you also see the abolition movement breaking apart itself, these internal divisions. One was because Garrison was a true radical. Right? He believed in women's rights, he believed in Black equality, and he believed in the end of slavery. And his political stances were very controversial, even for his allies within the abolition movement. This was somebody who publicly burned a copy of the Constitution and claimed that it was a covenant with death, right? Because it sanctioned this institution of slavery. He also encouraged Christians to come out of their churches, to denounce the churches, because the churches were in bed with slaveholders and they justified or held up this institution of slavery. As I said, he supported women's rights. He calls for the North to secede from the South. And this was too much for less radical, more moderate abolitionists like the Tappan Brothers, for instance. And by 1840, this anti-slavery society, which had been founded 7 years previous, dissolves, and it divides into two different groups here. In 1840, the abolition movement moves directly into the political scene with the formation of the Liberty Party, and they're going to run a man named James Birney in the 1840 presidential election. He will not win, of course, but this is seen as a movement into formal politics. And the Liberty Party, of course, its platform was ending slavery.